Hi, this is Brandon from Arabian Armory. Before we get started on the video, I'm going to say thanks to Josh Brownie. He's our Patreon supporter. If you like this kind of content, support us on Patreon. So, one of the important things to understand when it comes to sword fighting is what does a sword weigh? Weight is going to vary from sword type to sword type, but even within a specific category of sword, there's going to be a bit of variation. So hopefully this can give you some insight into what you might be looking for a specific type of sword. The first one I'm going to mention is my all-time favorite. This is my two-handed falchion. So my two-handed falchion is about 46 or so inches. It is 1,581 grams, or 3 pounds, 3.48 pounds. There we go. So a little bit under 3.5. There is a bit of variation with falchions, especially if you include one-handed and two-handed variations. But in two-handed medieval swords, whether they be single-edged or double-edged, generally you can expect something between 2.5-ish to, at the very high end, 5-ish. This is specifically talking about long swords, two-handed falchions, hand-and-a-half weapons. Similarly, this hand-and-a-half sword in particular is 1,417 grams, or 3.12 pounds. When you see something above 4, but not quite a great sword yet in terms of its length, if it's above 4 pounds and it's in the high 40s, low 50s in its total length, typically that's going to be a claymore. Claymore is not interchangeable with greatsword. Greatsword is a generic term, but it's also more specifically going to be used for English types. The claymore for Scotland, it specifically has a wider blade, and because it has less tapering with its wide blade, it's going to be a bit heavier. It's very common for the Scottish Highlanders to be using exceptionally heavy swords. You can actually get claymores that I think the heaviest one on record is 28 pounds, something inconceivably heavy. But that is not intended to be the norm, nor is it close to the norm. This idea that claymores were 15-pound behemoths is silly. No, most of them were going to be 5.5 pounds. Maybe the very long one's going to be 8 or 9 pounds, but yeah. Next, we can go to one-handed medieval swords like the arming sword. So this arming sword is 1,309 grams, or 2.88 pounds. Arming swords are going to be generally between 2.5 pounds to 3.5 pounds. I think the lowest, there are a couple that are around 2 pounds. Similarly, you can get a falchion like the Thorpe falchion that was 1.995 pounds, which at that point I think it was just 2 pounds, and then it had been sharpened when the owner who originally commissioned the thing had used it, and then it just dropped the tiniest bit below 2 pounds. But yeah, a one-handed sword, 2.88 pounds is perfectly normal. The variation you're going to get in weight for swords like this is going to be how much taper, which it has some taper, so you can see it's narrower here than it is back here. Very aggressive tapering is going to be lending itself to thrusting in gaps of armor or thrusting through links of chainmail. Less aggressive tapering is going to have much more cutting power. So obviously there's some give and take in there for what your preferences are. Next sword we have here is a Viking Svard. So this Svard is 1,161 grams, or 2.55 pounds. Viking swords were similar weight to arming swords. There was a couple of examples that are a bit heavier than the average of an arming sword. I suspect, and this is speculation, this is not me saying that this is definitive, but I suspect the reason why a Viking sword was heavier on average than an arming sword from a later period, Viking swords being used predominantly in like the year 800, 900, whatnot, as opposed to 1200, 1300 for the Crusader stuff. A couple reasons. One, steelworking was not as widely understood as it was later on, and so you can compensate for having a weaker type of steel by having more mass, and you still get some good cutting power, or you still get structural integrity so the sword's not going to break. Other things are, while chainmail was a very it was a prevalent type of armor in the Viking era, it's not common in that not everyone had it. Most people did not have it, and if you're not going to thrust through chainmail, you don't need a narrow pointed sword. A wide spatulated tip, a very broad aggressive blade profile is definitely going to be preferable, because if your target's unarmored, this will cleave them. Next we have the katana, which is 1,156 grams, or 2.55 pounds again. That's so close, it might even have been the same weight, it's just my scale was a bit off. I understand where people are coming from when they say it seems like a light blade, especially comparing this to the sword being identical weight. Interesting thing to note though, so when you compare them, a sword and a katana can have basically an identical length of blade. Most of that difference in length between these two is going to be in the longer handle for the katana. So having the advantage of leverage, two-handing the katana with that grip, that's where the speed is actually coming from. Other than that, it's generally not light in any other sense. If you slapped a longer handle on the Viking sword, gave it a little bit more of a taper to it, it would be the same weight. It would perform, not identical, but similar insofar as balance and leverage. Next is the Xiphos. The Xiphos here is 664 grams or 1.46 pounds. This is obviously the shortest weapon we have here. This is below 30 inches, something like 24. Anyways, the reason why I brought this up, not sure if I mentioned it before, is the author recently suggested that women can't sword fight because the sword is heavy, and he cited 5 to 10 pounds. And again, this is 3.5. This one is less than 3.25. This one is less than 3 pounds. This one is about 2.5. Katana is about 2.5, and the Xiphos is about 1.5 pounds. So the notion that a woman can't lift that or swing it is silly. And going further into, well, maybe they can't swing it hundreds of times. Well, maybe they can. Historically, there have been instances of female warriors. It's not an unheard of thing. Although probably 90% of career soldiers were men, that's not to say that a woman soldier is out of the question. Also consider, when you look at the differences in the average male or average female strength, also consider differences in the average strength of a royal person as opposed to a commoner. So if a royal person wants to be a soldier, if they want this to be their livelihood, a queen, because this is talking about The Witcher, a queen would definitely be able to afford the kind of diet necessary to build up a lot of muscle mass. They would also be able to afford the kind of training required, not just how to use a sword, but like physical training to gain that muscle mass I was talking about with their diet. So a woman becoming strong enough to fight on equal terms with a man and skilled enough, that's, of course, why not? But even with that, I wanted to note that strength really isn't so important in the sword fight, especially not if you're unarmored. But if you are armored, strength plays a little bit more, but not drastically so. Really what matters is skill, obviously, but for strength, speed is more important. If you can close in on a kill shot, that is what matters. You can find techniques where if you're shorter than your opponent, you can leverage up with your blade, catch their sword in your guard as you're defending from a headshot, then counter with a diagonal upward blow towards their neck. That's perfectly viable for someone who is shorter because they're a woman fighting a man. Absolutely. Or other techniques where someone is impacting you laterally on your blade. You can roll with it, step forward, and use the guard or the pommel as blunt force implements and hit them in the face. And this can crack a skull. This can go through the eye socket into someone's brain. That's perfectly viable, again, as killing blows. So I just don't understand how this person doubles down, despite having access to all these resources to fact check themselves, doubles down on the idea that a woman can't sword fight because the sword is too heavy. Another important thing, so I mentioned hundreds of swings or 200 swings or however many, because that's what this person referenced. You don't need to swing 100 times to kill someone. Obviously, you're probably not going to kill someone in just one swing. This isn't anime where you just dramatically unsheath your sword, slice them, put it back in, and you're done. No. But a duel really didn't last more than an exchange of maybe 12 blows. If you can kill them within 12 blows, that's not exceptional. That's just normal. Most people, when they are dueling, are going to be very coordinated about it. They're not going to extend for a strike if they don't think they're going to land it in the first place. And I think that's a different thing that you need to understand between real sword fighting that would have been happening in that period versus sports sword fighting today. There's not as much at stake because you're not literally going to die today. At least hopefully you don't. I mean, it has happened, but generally you're not going to die. Swords are going to be dulled out. You're going to be wearing safety equipment. Whereas, again, if you dedicate yourself to a swing and you miscalculate and you're wrong, you're going to be wide open, you're going to die. So you're probably not going to swing a whole bunch. You're not going to be like machine gunning it. So yeah, the character in question is a queen. She's sword fighting. She's good at it. She's strong enough to do it. I fully believe that this is a viable thing that can happen, even though this is a fantasy series. A real woman from that era could have, if she's royalty, again, eaten the right diet to get strong, gotten the kind of training necessary to do this. And the notion that being a woman, because you are shorter on average and weaker on average, is going to be a problem, and that specifically this author said that they wanted to cite sports in which, contact sports specifically, in which women could compete with men on equal grounds, and he says that there were none. Well, HEMA, European sword fighting, HEMA. So women and men can fight together and whatever gender you are. There's no gender segregation for men, not all, but many of these tournaments. Men and women and trans people are all fighting each other for rapier and dagger, or sword and buckler, or longsword, all these different categories. And there are still women that are champions. There are still women who win tournaments, because, like I mentioned, skill and speed are way more important than just being brute strength. But yeah, hopefully that's provided some insight into what a sword is supposed to weigh, and this silly sense of women being pathetic and helpless in battle. Like, no, if you're strong enough to pick this up, you are strong enough to kill with it. Anyways, have a good night.